Surely I'm not the only one who has this weird habit, where if a movie or a TV show is announced to get a remake or a reboot, I just get the sudden urge to go ahead and watch the original. This was the case with Spice and Wolf as well. I've known about the anime for some time now. I knew it's supposed to be good, and I had it on my watch list probably for years. But we all know what's usually the fate of the shows that end up on the watch list.
I'll put it on the list.
And it would have been the same for Spice and Wolf as well, if not for the announcement of the new iteration. That gave me the reason and the motivation to finally watch it, partly because it's good content, and secondly, this would be the first time where I could directly compare an older and a newer version of an anime, watching them back to back around the same time. I watch way more movies in my free time than what is healthy to admit, so I've seen plenty of reboots, remakes, and legacy sequels over the years, while watching most of their original versions as well. It's a common thing to do with movies, and there are franchises that make these kinds of cyclical rotations and repackaged ideas their whole identity. But I've never seen multiple versions of an anime before, so it made me really intrigued. I plan to watch the remake once it's finished airing, and then make a review out of it as well, comparing it to the original. So if you're interested in that, or other anime content in general, I'd really appreciate your subscription. And until then, let's see 2008's Spice and Wolf. When I asked a friend about the anime, he basically described it to me as a medieval economics course with the naked wolf girl in it. And after I watched it, I have to say, it is a fairly accurate summary. Although I feel like I have to tell you early on, if you start the series expecting some spicy fan service scenes throughout the season, based on the discussions about the first few episodes, you will be severely disappointed. Despite the people memeing around about it, this show is actually surprisingly reserved when it comes to this kind of stuff, especially compared to your average fantasy anime. There are only a handful of scenes in the first season where she appears without her clothes on. It always happens for a story reason, and mostly in the first episode where they meet for the first time. And even then, it's not portrayed as something particularly hot or sexual, partly because of the limitations of the old art style, but mostly it's intentional, or at least it feels like it. It comes across as something very naturalistic and insignificant, which is exactly how she feels about it. I'm personally very thankful for that, because it would have been very distracting from the otherwise fairly serious story, and it would have been just unnecessary and pointless anyway, to have some random fan service scene in every other episode. It still took me out of my immersion sometimes, but that wasn't exactly the anime's fault. Just every time I saw a sudden naked girl appear on the screen after a long and convoluted explanation about medieval merchant practices, I just couldn't stop getting reminded of this scene.
Subprime loans, tranches. It's pretty confusing, right? Does it make you feel bored or stupid? Well, it's supposed to. So here's Margot Robbie in a bubble bath to explain.
Basically, Louis Rainieri's mortgage bonds were amazingly profitable for the big banks. They made billions and billions on their 2% fee they got for selling each of these bonds.
Overall, I was pleasantly surprised by it, and I'm happy they didn't overuse it. We don't need it anyway. We already have all the superior forms of fan service present. Hugs, head pats, and hand-holding. If we want to talk about some actual plot, it's basically a medieval trading merchant slice of life show, and they stick to that concept through and through. We go from town to town, trading goods, always looking for better deals and more money-making opportunities. The anime takes this matter very seriously. They always try to explain the basics and the ideas behind the different practices very thoroughly, in an almost dry, matter-of-fact way, which can catch off guard some more casual viewers who got used to things getting explained to them oversimplified, slowly, multiple times by multiple characters. There is no Paimon here to just reiterate everything that has been said 5 seconds ago in case you didn't pay attention, or just skipped ahead in the story because your TikTok brain couldn't handle more than 30 seconds of dialogue without some Minecraft parkour or soap cutting to accompany it.
Also, how come after all this time we've spent searching for your brother, it turns out he's on the side of the abyss? What's up with that?
The show is very dialogue heavy, and if you don't pay attention to what they're talking about, you can get lost very quickly and have suddenly no idea why we're doing what we're doing exactly. But I don't say this as a bad thing. It actually feels really good and refreshing to have a fantasy anime that doesn't treat its viewers as toddlers watching something in the dentist waiting room. Obviously, these kinds of dialogue-based episodes wouldn't work this well if we wouldn't have this great of a chemistry between our main duo Holo and Kraft. Wow, that really sounds like something that could be a Roblox game mode. I can pretty confidently say that this is one of the best duos in anime that I've seen. They bounce off each other very well. It's entertaining and fun to watch their bickering, and they have this undergoing romance sub-storyline that isn't forced at all, and it doesn't feel as just fan service, but it comes across as something completely natural and believable that develops throughout the season. So it's easier to be invested in it as a viewer as well. I wasn't quite sold on Kraft's character at first. He just seemed like a very cold and calculating person with a very rational and practical focused mind, which is in line with what a good and successful merchant should be, but ultimately he just felt very bland and boring and hard to connect with. Even when it came to his first encounter with Holo, he still seemed just quite indifferent about it, rather just bothered by it more than anything, despite the fact that a demigod just appeared in front of him from a local religion he never really believed in the first place. It also didn't help how he treated women, well, Helena specifically. She had clearly very strong feelings towards him, and he just brushed it off as if it was just a nuisance to him. He never even said goodbye to her, and even before, he just tried to avoid her in general, which felt just rude and insensitive at the time I watched it. It's either this, or he's just simply too ignorant and lost in his own way of thinking to realize or consider how other people feel around him, which is a more acceptable quality for your average 14-year-old anime protagonist who hasn't really talked to a real girl before, who wasn't living in his computer.
Can't wait to see the look on Asmongold's face when he sees all that I can do.
But this is a grown-ass man we're talking about, and this lack of understanding made it very hard to like him. It gets better later on, and his dynamic with Holo forces him throughout the series to get better at it step by step, which gives him some proper character development, and it also provides an opportunity for him and Holo to be equals in their partnership, now that both of them have something to teach to the other. And Holo is just the perfect counterpart to him, both in charm and personality, but also in the sense of, she can just say the most woman things imaginable.
嘘でも惚れとるからというのがオスの解消じゃろう。このたわけが物事にはな、主よ。嘘でもいいから言ってほしい時と、今さら言ったら顔が腫れ上がるほど殴りたくなる時がありんす。今はどっちじゃと思う？それでもやっぱりあそこは言ってほしかった。じゃからもう一度じゃ。次からはわっちを怒らせてくれれ。主がいろいろ考えてくれるのは嬉しいが、場合によっては互いに怒って怒鳴り合った方が早く問題が片付くこともある。
種明かしをしてやろうか？
わっちは頼まん。じゃが言いたければ勝手にいいんす。もう少し酒が入ったら自然と会話に加わる。それまで待っておれ。じゃあ待ってますね。
で、何の話でしたっけ？お前も食うか？
勝手にやってるからよい。しばらくほっとくんじゃら。
そうだったな。
怒りとともに覚えておこう。なぜおらぬ？肝心な時にそばにおらぬとは役に立たぬおすじゃ。
とにかく俺は鈍いらしいからな。
医者に治せぬ病にかかっても簡単に気づきそうにないからな。
ん？
なんでもありんせ。
ああ、ノーラに頼めばいい父が手に入るから。
金に物を言わせればあの小娘に限らず良いものが買えるじゃろうが。
それはそうかもしれないが。
知れないがなんじゃ。主よ、もう一度チャンスをやる。今名前を呼んでみよう。主は二度ほど神の与えた幸福をつかみ損ねた。今度こそうまくつかまんと幸福の尻尾は逃げていくかもしれないぞよ。
おい、どういう意味だ？おい、ほら、待てってば。
Seriously, I don't know who wrote these lines, but if you're a guy, I'm so sorry for what you must have been through, buddy. She's also usually very self-aware about it, which makes it just extra funny. She knows that when Kraft doesn't pick up on something she wants to hear from him, or him to do for her, it's not because he doesn't care about her or because he deliberately ignores her. He's just not very good when it comes to these kinds of social interactions. And she's aware that she's not the greatest either in communicating her feelings clearly to the people around her. So they're both mindful about their shortcomings, and they try to be understanding towards each other and work through their conflicts together as best as they can. And that is just such a nice and heartwarming thing to see. The other aspect that sells the show for me besides the characters is just the setting, being medieval Europe. If you didn't know, I live in the great country of Hungary, in the middle of Europe, and as such I always had an admiration for the continent, and I very rarely see it represented in anime. So it's always a special occasion when I find a show based on one of our locations. On top of that, it takes place in my favorite historical era, the medieval period. History classes were always the ones I was the most curious and enthusiastic about, but I always lost interest when we got to the conflicts of the Hamburger Land and the big pew-pews with the funny mustache man. But up to that point, I loved listening to how these early countries developed and grew their economy, tried to govern the people, fought with the church, etc. And that is just perfectly represented in this anime, how the different kings and rulers played around with the silver and gold percentages in their coins to mess with the marked, the traders and merchants organizing into guilds and building trust-based systems to avoid physically carrying some of the goods, preventing robberies along the way. Trying everything you can not to piss off the church or your life will just be ruined in a second. And to the extension of that, condemning everyone as a witch for doing anything remotely out of the ordinary that people might not fully understand. Or just being a woman in general who the men of the town don't really like to be around. These are all core components to the authentic medieval European experience that actually happened like this, and Spice and Wolf captures that flawlessly, to the point where I just couldn't stop but smile every time they showed us another aspect of this world. I don't know exactly if this is the reason for it, but I just never saw an anime with such strong European vibes before, and believe me, I've seen a lot of fantasy settings throughout the years. But they always felt just so bland and lifeless in comparison, with the typical AI-generated fantasy lands of the millions of isekai shows. I'm really curious what you think about this, or if you felt the same way, and what's your reasoning for it? Maybe it's because of the realism how Spice and Wolf uses its world in the story. Because, other than the fact that Holo is a special wolf girl non-human being, there isn't any other supernatural element in the show present, and they stick to keeping the world grounded and believable. The other factor that helps with the mood is actually the art style, which might sound a bit strange at first hearing, because you can very clearly see looking at it that Spice and Wolf is an older show, with a more rough drawing style, and an often slightly washed-out color palette. But somehow these qualities of the visuals help give the show this old and rustic look and feeling, which is perfectly in line with the core concept of the anime itself. And rather than holding it back, it just strengthens the immersion. I don't know if that was intentional from the start, or if it just worked out very fortunately with the show slowly aging, but either way, I really liked it. Of course we can't talk about the show's atmosphere without mentioning the perfect soundtrack, and when I say perfect, I mean it. It is so coherent and unified all throughout the series, while giving us a huge range of emotions accompanying the current situation exceptionally. Be that joy, sorrow, stressfulness, haunting tunes, some happy moments in the tavern, strolling through the city market, being in danger, and accomplishing all that with just a few instruments, all of which you can easily imagine being used in that time period. If the reboot tries to create a new OST, it has very big shoes to fill. There was one other thing in the anime that very much warmed my European heart. It's a really small detail, but I still wanted to mention it, and that is that the characters in Spice and Wolf are just way more physical with each other, it feels like. Not in a weird way or anything. It's a bit hard to properly explain. I joked earlier about those adorable hugs, head pats, and hand-holding moments between Kraft and Holo, and I don't know if it's just me or others notice the same thing, but watching the show, I just felt like they do these kinds of things to each other way more frequently than what I'm usually used to in other animes. That was a thing that I really had to get used to when I first started watching animes. That culturally, or just out of habit, I don't know, Japanese people are way more reserved when it comes to physical contact, especially between the different genders. At least that's the conclusion I came to based on my very limited knowledge by watching their cartoons, so obviously take this with a grain of salt. In America, or here in Europe, we hug each other left and right. It's a very common and casual thing for us. And that mindset transcends into the different media we produce, movies, series, etc. And after years of watching them, I had a lot of these moments in my early anime watching days, where the characters were just in a highly emotional situation, where I just naturally assumed as some kind of a resolution or just as some emotional support, that they just go ahead and hug each other or something. But instead, they just awkwardly standed there and looked at each other, dramatically saying each other's names out loud, and I was just left there with the feeling of they're just edging my emotions or something. And I don't say that this is a bad thing necessarily. It's definitely something you just have to get used to, but once you do, there are a lot of cases where this kind of approach can be quite rewarding with the right circumstances. Like, the way how casual we're about it here means that the value of these interactions is just naturally deflated. But when an anime does it during some final, cathartic, emotional high or low point of the series, it just hits so much harder and feels so much more impactful. Anyway, I'm going on a bit of a tangent here. The point is that the characters here seemed just less shy in general with these kinds of gestures, which made them feel like they have more of a European attitude and way of thinking, and for me that helped the authenticity greatly. It's also very understandable if you just take one look at this adorable creature. I've seen a lot of anime girls with animalistic qualities in my life, but I swear this show was the best so far to actually take advantage of that. Even with the slightly outdated animation style, every single one of those little ear moves or tail wiggles is just so unbelievably cute that it's no surprise Kraft just wants to hold her and hug her until the rest of his life. Or until the stock prices suddenly change. A man has to have his priorities. That probably concludes the first batch of my initial thoughts about the series. I've only seen the first season and the 2 extra episodes so far. I plan to finish the rest of it as well. It's just, suddenly, something came up that occupied my attention in recent days. If you want to see my impressions on that, or just other series or movie stuff, then please consider subscribing and doing all the following stuff people do. I do more than just anime content, I swear. Anyway, I think I said everything I wanted, and there's nothing that I left out. Oh yeah, what's up with the ending song and planting 7 seeds inside of her?